In the previous lecture, we began our discussion on crystal structure, and so far we have understood what is a lattice, what is a motif, and what is a crystal. Okay. So now we should be able to make out a crystal. I mean, we should be able to define something which can generate the crystal, because there are billions of atoms in a solid and we won't be able to see all the atoms together and try to put them in a pattern, right? So we need a unit which, when repeated, can generate the crystal structure, right? So in that sense, we can define what is called as a unit cell. So we go back to that periodic arrangement of points, one lattice. So you can see these points again in a periodic arrangement. Okay. So if I connect two lattice point with a vector like this is known as a translation. So if you remember, there was a term that we used, translationally periodic arrangement, right? So that means this point should be able to repeat every time if I apply a translation. For example, if I apply this translation on x direction, I have a point. If I go the same distance on the y direction, I have another point. So that means there is a pattern. It is repeating. So that's what we mean by translation. And it doesn't have to be these 2 points. It could be any other 2 points also. For example, this can also define a translation. Okay, so translation can be defined as any vector from one lattice point to another So now we can conveniently connect these lattice points to generate a unit. As I said, you can connect whatever way you want, but practically the neighboring points are connected. The adjacent points are connected. So for example, we can connect these 4 points like this, and this will define a unit which can be repeated in all the 3 directions in space to generate the entire crystal structure. For example, if I repeat it on the x-axis, on the x direction, you would see I have exactly the same unit, right? If I repeat it on the y direction, again, I see that I have exactly the same pattern, right? So that is true when you do it on the z direction also. When you do it on the third direction, this will come true. So I can define a unit which, when repeated in the space, can generate the entire crystal structure. Okay. So now we define unit cell. Technically, it can be defined as a region in space which can generate the entire lattice by repeating itself through translation. All right. So this is how you can define the unit cell. The meaning of this we have already understood, right? You can take a unit, a single unit like this, the shaded one over here, right? And if you repeat this, we have seen that the entire structure, the entire crystal can be generated. You can choose any other points also to generate a unit cell. For example, this is also a translation, right? So this would also give you a unit cell. So unit cell is not unique. So this is a property that you should understand, a property of unit cell. Unit cell is not unique. It is just a convenient way of connecting lattice point. That's all, right? So unit cell is not unique because there are infinite number of ways that lattice points can be connected, right? But we can always choose conveniently how we want to choose and define a unit cell for our convenience. All right. We'll see more about it as we go along. We can also define types of unit cells. We can define two types. One is known as primitive and another is non-primitive. Primitive is a unit cell where you have lattice point only at the corners. And a non-primitive is the one where you have lattice points at corners plus other places, other positions also. Let me elaborate a bit what I mean. So when you connect the points in 2D, you basically generate a parallelogram, right? As we have seen before here. All right. So if I place the lattice points only at the corners of that, then it will be called as the primitive unit cell. In 3D, what will this become? The parallelogram. So this is in 2D, and if I talk about 3D, it will be parallelepiped. And in this, if I have the lattice points only at the corners, then I will call that as a primitive unit cell. On the other hand, if I have a unit cell wherein I have lattice points at the corner and also at other positions. For example, if I choose a lattice like this, as I said, I am free to choose this. This will define a lattice, but now you see what has happened. You have lattice points at the corners. Additionally, you have a lattice point at the center. So apart from corners, you also have additional lattice points in other positions. So this is a non-primitive unit cell. Okay. More of this we are going to see when we talk about the crystal structures, the 7 crystal systems that we have and the 14 Bravais lattices. Okay. So these are two types of unit cells. Have you noticed something very unique about the lattice? We have understood what is a lattice, but there is something which is unique about it. Unless you have that characteristic in the arrangement of points, we cannot call that a lattice. And what is that unique characteristic? If you look at any point and its neighborhood, the neighboring point, you will see that every point will have the same neighborhood. Every point will have the same environment in terms of the spatial orientation of the neighboring points. For example, I go back to this lattice again, these points, and if I go along this direction, I encounter one lattice point. Exactly same distance, if I go on the other direction, I encounter a point. This is true for every other point. Unless this characteristic is there, we cannot call this a lattice. So a more accurate definition of lattice would be this, from this perspective, that a lattice is an array of points in space in which the environment of each point is identical. This must be there. Okay, then only we can call that a lattice. So this is a more appropriate definition for a lattice. Okay, I can demonstrate it with a small example again, and that will also lead us to a characteristic of the motif also. Okay, so this is a 2D lattice. This is basically the structure of graphene. You can see that nice those nice hexagons. Graphene is a single layer of graphite which has a hexagonal kind of arrangement of the carbon atoms. So if I go in this direction, a particular distance, you would see that there is an atom, there is a lattice point, right? So if I start placing a lattice point like this to generate a lattice, this set of points, these two neighboring atoms, neighboring carbon atoms, will not generate a lattice. Remember how we defined a lattice? That every point should have identical environment. So this point, if you consider, right, if I go a distance on this direction, I do not have a lattice point. But if you consider this point, and if I go exactly the same distance along the same direction, I do have an atom. I do have a point, right? So that means this pair of points cannot generate a lattice. But if I consider the alternative points, alternative atoms, or the centers of alternative atoms, you would find there is a nice pattern coming out. If I just consider the alternative atoms, okay, and if I start placing the points at the centers of the alternative carbon atoms, I find this pattern, and you can see this is a nice periodic arrangement of points, and this is basically the structure of graphene. This is the lattice of graphene. But I could not place two carbon atoms. So now if I again start placing one carbon atom around each of these lattice points, will I get the structure of graphene? Let us do that first. I start placing one atom at each of these points. Now compare with the first one. Keep this in your mind for you to compare it with the one that we have generated just now by placing one atom around each of those lattice points. Okay. Do you see the same structure? You don't, because there is one more atom that we need to have here in order to generate the structure of graphene. So if I start placing one more atom now, this is the pattern that we have, the lattice of graphene. Now if I start placing a pair of atoms around these points in this manner periodically, you would see like a magic, that the structure of graphene is again generated. What does it mean? It means that motif doesn't have to be a single atom. It can be a group of atoms also. That is why the definition of motif says an atom or a group of atoms. And this is an example of more than one atom when you have a group of atoms. Okay. So in this class, we have understood what is a lattice, and we have also understood what is meant by a unit cell. All right.